All right, everybody. Today we have a special guest with us, the Apostate Prophet. You may know him from YouTube, and he does a lot of content on the issue of Islam. AP, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I hope that what we discuss will be helpful to some of our viewers today, because we're going to be diving into, is there evidence for Islam? And I'm really curious, when you were a Muslim, what evidence was it that you felt was compelling to be a Muslim? Or for example, maybe there was a evaluation of the evidence associated with Islam that eventually led you out of Islam. So I'm just curious, maybe how we can just kind of dive into that broad scope of the evidence associated with Islam, and what does it tell us about Islam? Is it God's religion?
Very interesting question. Requires a very long answer, I would say.
Go ahead.
First off, how do you want me to refer to you? Pastor Kyle? Kyle? What do you want to? Whatever
Kyle's
you want.
fine.
Okay. That's fine. That's good.
Yeah.
Kyle. Okay. So it's hard to say, really. I mean, I was born into a very religious Muslim family. It's not like I got into Islam because I was so curious and was, at some point convinced that Islam is true. I simply grew up in a religious family, which was very devout and which really, tried to observe and follow the religion as much as possible. Um, I wasn't that religious throughout my youth and all that. I was rather careless at times and more interested in different politics that were actually contrary to the Islamic beliefs and values
Mm.
of my family. But at some point in my late youth, early adult times, I think I became more and more interested in becoming a very religious Muslim and doing all the things that are required of me. What held me, I don't know, this is actually a very weird thing to think about. When you think back, it's like the mind is a little bit of a strange thing, right? When you think back, everything is a little bit distorted, and I can hardly believe that things that seemed plausible to me back then actually did seem plausible to me. It
Mm.
looks like no, it was all just absurd back then as well. But I think back then, when I was a Muslim, I did simply hold on to some very basic thoughts of why Islam is obviously true, and many of those had to do with me feeling that Islam is true, feeling close to Islam, feeling that I am on the right track, feeling like I'm doing the right thing when I go to pray at the mosque or when I abstain from certain sins. Um, Feeling uncomfortable when I go into different settings of different religions, like a church, for example, that was not something that was divinely inspired. It was just something that I was indoctrinated with, which is why that happened. Um, but aside from that, I mean, the whole idea that I was given was that there is definitely a God, Allah, and He communicates with human beings. That is why we exist, and He demands us to worship Him and to believe in Him. And obviously, the Bible has been corrupted. The previous scriptures sent to the Jews and the Christians have been corrupted, which is why Allah sent a correct scripture to Muhammad, which is the only right one, and it is the only scripture that is demonstrably unchanged, that cannot be changed, and that
Mm.
has no mistakes. It is a beautiful scripture. It sounds very nice to the ear. Muhammad made many prophecies and showed many miracles and so on, and these clearly prove that Islam is true. I mean, it was such a
Ah.
basic, simple understanding, but it's just once you begin to analyze and deconstruct these things with an open mind that you realize that these things are not really evidence.
Ah. Yeah. So you said that you were interested in politics that would have deviated from what was acceptable in Islam, and then but at some point afterward you became more serious about Islam.
Yeah, yeah.
So how did that work? Yeah.
Well, I was a little bit rebellious, I guess, because I grew up in Germany, where my parents lived when I was born. And at some point when I was 16, we moved to Turkey, and I really didn't want to do that because I really liked Germany and how people live and think, and Turkey was very different to me. And then I began to explore different politics and got into how the world is unfair and how capitalism and imperialism and all of that is unfair. And I became, in a short time, a very hardcore revolutionary communist. Like, people try to describe themselves as socialists, and communism is the eventual ideal that is beyond that. But I was directly going for communism, and that was completely unacceptable to my family and their very Islamic beliefs, because they consider democracy um, disbelief and idolatry. They were saying that democracy is incompatible with their own beliefs, because when we vote for specific parties, we are associating partners with Allah, who is the only authority to rule over how we live.
Ah.
And that's how extreme it is. And I then go a step further and say, hey, away with secularism and democracy and all that. I will go directly for communism and state atheism. And that was just completely unacceptable.
So what kind of politics are acceptable in Islam? Sharia? I mean, who is? How does that work exactly? I mean, what would it be? A monarchy? A theocracy is the only acceptable form of government in Islam?
It depends on who you ask, but traditionally seen within the accepted Islamic belief system, speaking for Sunni Islam, Shia Islam has a little bit of a different path that they went toward. But within Sunni Islam, what is accepted according to the Islamic jurisprudential schools is that people are supposed to be led by a caliph or a caliph who is known as the commander and the leader of the Muslims, in charge of upholding Islamic law, protecting Islam, protecting their own people, and spreading Islam through diplomacy or military. And so that is the Islamic system. Now, in Muhammad's time, Muhammad himself was the leader. After he died, his companions, as they are called, became leaders, 4 of them. And then it all changed and turned into a dynasty and kind of a monarchy with a succession system. But that was accepted in that time. But what people generally say and what the tradition says is that you are supposed to have an Islamic state with clear Islamic rules.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that's where Shia and Sunni, there's a battle of successors in those, in a way, right?
Yes, Shia. You could say
They claim to
developed
have the
this.
proper successor, each one. Is that right?
Yeah, Shia Muslims don't accept the first 3 leaders, caliphs of the Sunni Muslims. They jump to the 4th one and say he was the righteous one, and they don't accept anything that came after that. So they have this system called the Imam system. The 12 for Shia Muslims, who are the majority nowadays in Iran, for example, had 12 imams after whom the Day of Judgment were supposed to come, but it never happened, and it's all a little bit of a mess.
Yeah. So what led you to eventually find those justifications? You mentioned, obviously you first have to believe God exists. Secondly, that God is Allah. Thirdly, that the Bible was at once his word and then somehow got corrupted, which is strange to think about when you really think about a theology of God transmitting his words. Why would God first provide a word that would go bad and then have to provide a second word? But we can get to that later. And then your final point was that the Quran had certain characteristics, it sounded like what you were saying, that to you was proof of its divine origins, something like that. What eventually led you to start saying, those arguments aren't really holding water?
Well, it took a while. I mean, for many years, after I began to realize that the whole communist idea doesn't really work for me, I turned towards Islam. I think that was also triggered by a very tragic event that happened in my own life. Where my aunt, who was very close to me, was killed by her husband, whom she was trying to separate. And she was always very close to me and tried to talk to me about how she's interested in Islam and all that. And I don't know, all those events kind of led me toward reflecting upon my own worldviews and going closer to Islam. So I practiced my Islamic beliefs properly, prayed every day, prayed additional prayers more than required, studied day and night, read the Quran several times. And there were always several doubts in my head. And it was during my obligatory military service in Turkey that I had a lot of time to actually sit down and think about the things that I believe in. And it was there that I began to think, hey, the Quran tells me that I'm supposed to use my mind and think. Of course, the Quran says, the Quran doesn't say, hey, use your mind, you're intelligent. The Quran says, use your mind, then you will know that Islam is true. How dare you believe otherwise? That's what it says. But if you just take the words, use your mind, then I thought if it is Allah who creates me and gives me this mind and he tells me to think, then why would I be scared of actually, questioning some of the things that I believe in, some of the things that I have suppressed so far? So I began to kind of confront some of my doubts about how the Quran describes the natural world around us, or Allah's system of justice, or how Allah treats Christians and Jews, whom he initially describes as righteous people who have nothing to fear, but eventually they are described as the worst of creatures who will go to hell and burn there forever. And but they have no fault for being Christians and Jews. And it was all his scheme in the end, if you look at it.
So you
Within
had
a
all of those questions just kind of packed
Yeah,
down deep
yeah,
inside. Yeah.
it was all piling up, and I was trying to suppress everything by telling myself, "Hey, I am in no place to question these things. I am a weak human. I'm just supposed to leave those to others or to Allah and to obey and pray and all that." But eventually, I had to open my mind, and once I did that, it all fell apart.
Yeah. Okay. So what is it that you have found to be problematic with the Quran?
Oh,
That's a big question, but I guess if you could pinpoint some major points of departure, I suppose, that kind of made the crumbling effect commence.
so over the last years, I have given many reasons why I no longer believe in Islam, and I'm not exaggerating. Some of these things arose after I left Islam, but many of these things were there when I was still a believer. And that's the problem. I kept piling them up and trying to put them away, put them under the rug, but it just didn't work. And I guess one of the major things is how the Quran is seemingly very ignorant about the natural worlds, about science. Muslims often say, as a response to this nowadays, the Quran is not a book of science; it's a book of
Yeah.
science. But that's not a good excuse, because the Quran directly, actively, explicitly tries to refer to the wonders of the natural world and how Allah made them in order to prove that it is indeed the word of the Almighty Creator. And while doing so, it makes some great mistakes and presents a perspective of the natural world that was prominent within 7th century Arabia, such as that the sun goes to a resting place at night, which is something that the Quran literally says. That the moon and the sun chase each other, that Allah brings the sun from the east. Muhammad says further that one day Allah will bring the sun from the west by telling it, go back where you came from, and then it will travel to the other side and come from the west. That stars are missiles thrown at devils, that Allah holds up the sky so it doesn't fall down on us. And the sky is not an object, it's it's just what
Yeah.
appears to us, and so on. I mean, these are just that's just one aspect, the scientific aspect. There are, of course, other things, such as that the Quran, you could say, appropriates Abrahamic biblical tradition and changes the narrative.
Right. Well, on the natural world piece, if the Quran did not present that initial point that you mentioned, where it's saying, "Hey, the natural world, um, if you look at it, is the way I heard what you were saying is that the natural world is going to somehow confirm the Quran's authority, or what the Quran says about the natural world." It's almost like saying, "Hey, test what we're saying, and it will show you that what we're saying is true." If it didn't have that, um, you know, challenge, so to say, maybe you could have reinterpreted some of those things to be metaphorical, but it seems that the Quran's not allowing for that, and so it's almost a self-defeating document. Is that one way to
Yeah,
describe it?
yeah, yeah. I mean, and the Quran makes it clear that these things are said in order to prove that that it is from God. It doesn't say
Yeah,
directly, "Hey, this is my argument for God's existence," but it says things like, uh, "Do they not look at the sky, how it is held up by Allah? Or can they see a crack in the sky? They can't. Or who brings the sun from from the east, and can they bring it from the west?" Or things like this. It keeps referring to Allah's might by referring to certain things in the natural world, and of course, you are then to you are to take those arguments and believe that it is indeed Allah who does these things, because how else could it work? And if you want to
mhm,
critically analyze the Quran, it is therefore naturally expected that you actually analyze those claims and verify whether they describe things as they are or not. And
mm,
the thing about the Quran is, you could say that, for example, the biblical books, for example, are known to be written by people who are inspired by God for the most part, which is different in the Quran. In the Quran, it is not that Allah inspires people and they then write things. In the Quran, it
right.
is directly Allah's word for word, verbatim, onto the
Yeah,
paper through an angel and Muhammad. So there is simply no excuse. It is directly Allah's own speech and his
yeah,
attempt to prove his own might. And if you look at it critically, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't work.
yeah. That's where my mind went, because what some of the verbiage that you were using, if we were to find it in a document like the Bible, it would not be an issue for us, because our view of inspiration is so different
Hmm.
than Islam. But I think Christians, the reason I wanted to raise that point is that one of the challenges that Christianity faces is properly training Christians to know what our view of inspiration is, what our view of anything is. So many Christians just grow up in church and don't really go to more than Sunday morning. And on Sunday morning, we're not talking about theories of inspiration from the pulpit, you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so um, it's quite interesting to think that dictation theory of inspiration that's inherent in Islam ends up creating such a problem for things that could easily be taken as metaphorical. Or even when we look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis in the Bible, we're talking about a Mesopotamian setting. We're talking about a narrative that's being given to a people in a certain time in a certain place. And for us as biblical scholars, we'll look at that and say God is speaking to the people of that region in that time frame, and there's no issue in it dealing in metaphorical languages, using the language of, you could say, allegory. Mike Jones takes that approach, or William Lane Craig takes the mytho-history approach. These things are not difficult in the realm of a view of inspiration where God is cooperating with the people of the time to inspire a certain revelation of himself. Uh, yeah, quite interesting.
There's if I may give my quick opinion on that. I mean, when I read the Bible, um, when I read Genesis or even Ecclesiastes, which has a very poetic language, but it's a book that I really like. uh,
It's a great book.
yeah,
I'm with
yeah,
you on that.
yeah. I
Some
love
people
it.
think it's very dark, but I think it's very real, and
That's why
that's
I
what I
love
love
it.
about it.
That's why I love it. It's like it really appeals to to stuff that I like to think about, and it's repeated thing like. All is vanity and all that. Anyway, so
Yeah.
but certain descriptions of the natural world that you find in the Bible, like I would sit back and think, if it is God's plan to communicate to people and to give them a certain thing which is supposed to appeal to humanity for all times, you could say, then I would expect that that it may not be interpreted on a plain reading as a rather primitive understanding of how the world functions. That's my expectation. But then you could say that's just my expectation. In Christianity, I mean, you guys have room for interpreting why that is the case and how the Bible was formed and why the Bible is the way it is. In Islam, you don't really have the means to interpret it that way, because in Islam you have this idea that it is simply plain as it is, word for word, the word of Allah. And there is no
Right.
question about it. And these are proofs for Islam's truth. And you are supposed to confront these proofs. If you want to say
Yeah.
today, it's not a book of science. Well, that's a terrible excuse. I'm sorry. The Quran directly makes those arguments for proofs. And
Yeah.
it's expected of me to analyze them, to break them down.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to think that the approach that Islam takes to inspiration, it was new. In Jewish Christian history, no one really looked at the inspiration of scripture to be that kind of a process. And so even when we look at Mormonism, when we look at the way that Joseph Smith supposedly translated the golden tablets from the angel Moroni, it's a dictation approach there to inspiration. It's kind of strange, because once you take that stance and you're saying these words are direct utterances of God, in every single way, shape, and form, when you bring it to the test and you find that it doesn't hold water, it's devastating.
I mean, even in the you mentioned Judaism, even in the rabbinic tradition, they had this whole system which they set up, in which they refer to the Hebrew Bible and say God said, but then they have their rabbis as an authority who sit down in lengthy discussions and debates and interpret what is being said and what God expects of you now, today, and
Yes.
moving forward. And what's funny is the Quran actually criticizes that in a very strange way, and refers to that as Jews worshiping their rabbis and taking them for gods.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
it's very strange.
It is very strange. Yeah. So you were going to mention how it distorts Abrahamic narratives, something to that extent.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
it
where we
just
kind of left off.
something that I was kind of stuck on back then when I was on the verge of leaving Islam was the whole story of Abraham taking his son and being asked to make a sacrifice, and then being stopped and given a lamb. In the Abrahamic tradition, you learn that it is Isaac who is the son here in this case. In Islam, suddenly it is Ishmael, and when I noticed this difference, I thought to myself, "Wait a minute, why? Why would this change happen?" You
Hmm.
could say that the Jews and Christians distorted their scripture as it is claimed within the Islamic tradition. But really, I mean, changing the, you know,
That's a big feat to get
changing the
away with
son
that.
from Isaac to Ishmael, and people just kind of, it just somehow worked. That's a very strange change. And of course, one of the explanations that people give, Muslim apologists give, is that the Jews are descendants of Isaac, and the Muslims or the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael's tradition, which is why the Jews wanted to be the important ones and claimed that it was Isaac instead of Ishmael. And it's just a horrible explanation which I cannot make sense of. But
Yeah, it seems like a hard feat to pull off. It reminds me of something to the effect of the conspiracy explanation of the disciples stealing the body, and for me, that to me is harder to believe than an actual resurrection. I know that's would be a rabbit to chase, but
yeah, that's not an
how
explanation that I would
could
go for.
yeah, it's not a very good one. And I mean, how do you conspire to change the literal son that Abraham brought to
Yeah, the whole
young
narrative
Moriah?
is strange, and not just that. It's also the Kaaba, for example, was a big problem to me, because at some point, I mean, you don't think about this. Muslims live their entire lives and never think about this, but um, there is a time, if you think about it. This is why I'm trying to emphasize this in on my videos occasionally. I'm trying to talk about the Kaaba more and more to kind of make people think about this. But when you think about it, in Islam, you are told that the Kaaba is this beloved house of Allah, which He built, the first house of worship. And Adam went to that place according to an old tradition, but according to the Quran, Abraham went there and built it and called all humanity to come there and worship, and this was like very important. But then when you look at the actual historical and Abrahamic context, you find that the Kaaba is not something that appears ever anywhere until the rise of Islam. Nobody cared about the Kaaba. It has nothing to do with Abrahamic tradition, with Abrahamic religion. It has no history that we can trace. It is simply something that Islam adopted from pre-Islamic polytheist Arabs, and that Abraham clearly had nothing to do with, if he existed, just viewing it from a historical point of view. So the whole idea that the Kaaba is this great house of worship from the one and almighty God is a very problematic thing to think about. And once you think about that, it becomes just more and more problematic.
Yeah. So on the Quran, we have also the claim that Jesus wasn't crucified. Would you side with historical scholars on the notion that Jesus certainly existed and was crucified under Pontius Pilate, or are you still reviewing the evidence for that?
I mean, I would say that my perspective on that would be rather, how do you say it, rudimentary. But I don't know. But I would say, from how I view it, how I see it, I agree with certain things that Bart Ehrman thinks as well. He says that we have no reason to doubt the existence of Jesus. If we doubt the existence of Jesus, we would have to doubt the existence of many other historical figures that we take for granted, that we say existed. I'd say there is no reason to think that people somehow invented this person. He did exist, and he was probably involved in some in a controversy and was probably crucified. That's what I would say is the most reasonable perspective. Aside from that, nothing to me, as I view it, is really verifiable. Everything else depends on traditions. This is, I guess, where I kind of depart from Bart Ehrman's view. He thinks that much of what you can find in the Bible, in the New Testament, is actually based on proper historical facts. But I would say it's hard to verify. But that's just me. I don't know.
So do you find the claim that Jesus wasn't crucified and it was only made to appear as crucified? Was that problematic for you, or was that one of the lesser problematic ones?
I forgot that that's what we were actually talking about
on Quran.
So I didn't really think about this before I left Islam and began to critically analyze it. It's not something that you are encouraged to think about. The Quran simply says that Jesus was alive. He preached worship in one God, and that he was. People tried to crucify him, but the Quran then says that it was only made to appear that way, but they did not kill him. Somebody else, was made to appear like him, and Jesus was raised to heaven. That's what it says. Of course, I had the view that I cannot doubt the Quran, so I believe whatever it says. I didn't question this or analyze this. From today's perspective, it just seems like that is a belief that was adopted from certain Christian or Gnostic sects over time, who invented this idea that Jesus is beyond human. He is completely detached from the human flesh, from earthly things. He is a spirit or divine, which is why he cannot have been crucified. Somebody else was crucified instead of him. This is a Gnostic
Right.
idea that people developed and that Christians vastly rejected as a heretical belief. But this tradition existed within societies up until the time of Islam and further on. And the Muslims or Muhammad probably adopted this idea without realizing that this idea is actually in confirmation that Jesus is more than just human.
Yeah.
But the Muslims adopted this idea while completely rejecting the idea that Jesus is more than human, while saying that Jesus is only a human. So it doesn't really make sense. If Jesus was only a human, only a messenger, why was he not crucified? Why is it so terrible to believe that he was crucified? Muslims don't really have a proper explanation to this. It's incoherent. So in my view, this is merely an ignorant appropriation of certain beliefs that people held.
Yeah. I think it was Satan trying to rob the narrative of the atonement.
Well,
because it's
there you
only
go.
the most important part of the story.
Yeah. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's think about this for a second. This is something that David often points out to David Wood. But think about this for a second. According to the Quran, people try to crucify Jesus, but Allah makes somebody else appear like him and raises Jesus to heaven. And people then go on, Christians go on with the belief that Jesus was crucified and then resurrected. It looks like, if you buy the Quranic narrative and that this was somehow Allah's trick, it looks like Allah, through this trick, invented the greatest false religion, Christianity, in the world.
Yeah.
This was all his problem,
For
all
what purpose?
his creation. What is wrong with you?
And then waited till 600 years afterwards
Yeah.
to bring a corrective
Exactly.
document.
Exactly. It is.
Yeah.
It is dumb.
I agree. Okay. So who is Muhammad? Like, now that you have left Islam, like, what was the process like to go from viewing Muhammad as a prophet to now a historical person? And as a historical person, what do you think he actually is?
Well, so when I was a Muslim, Muslims have a very strange relationship with Muhammad. It's like you're supposed to love him and obey him and love him more than you love your father and your mother, which makes sense if you are talking about God or, the Son of God. It doesn't make sense when you're talking about a mere human messenger guy whom you are supposed to love more than anything else and obey, and you are supposed to recognize him when you testify that you are a Muslim in order to become a Muslim and in order to go to heaven. It's very strange. I mean, Abrahamic religion doesn't have such a concept. You have the belief in God. In Christianity, you have the belief that Jesus, the Son of God, who is also God, is, who we are supposed to believe in him. In Islam, you suddenly have this idea that you're supposed to believe in this guy and love him more than anything else in order to go to heaven. So as a Muslim, I also had this expected belief and feeling that he is my leader, the authority that I'm supposed to love and follow with all my heart, who did nothing but righteous things. He made no mistakes. He did nothing bad, and so on. Today, as I view it, I think that he was a guy who really tried to change something in his time, but he also had some great problems. I am of the view that he had mental problems, which were recognized as divine revelations in his time. We have many evidences for that in the traditions about him, which say that he would suddenly go quiet and not move, and then come back and start revealing Quran verses, that he would lay down on the ground and shake and make loud snorting noises like a camel. He would sweat. He would rapidly move his tongue and his lips. He would hear the ringing of a bell before he comes up with new Quran verses, have hallucinations, and so on. And these are things that make me think he had problems. And you know, if he lived in our time, people would have probably evaluated him based on psychiatric, professions, and find out that he needs help. Back in the day, they thought he was a prophet, and of course, I would say that he also. I think he believed that he was indeed inspired by a god or by something. He was tricked by his own mind. But I think that he also, as a human with certain desires and a certain selfishness, was motivated to make use of this as much as possible and to create himself to create power for himself and to spread his religion by force and to establish himself as an authority. I think that's what Muhammad was. And there is no reason for any of us to believe that he was actually a true prophet, that he was inspired by God, that he did any of the things that he claimed he did in his mind.
Did Muhammad make any predictions that did not come true?
Yeah. Many of them. He said in a certain report, it is said that certain people come to him and ask him, when is the day of judgment? Or when is they say, when will the hour be? And the hour, unanimously in Islamic tradition, in the reports, is 100% always used in reference to the last hour, the coming of the day of judgment. So they come and say, when will the hour be? He then looks at a young boy in their presence and says, before this boy grows very old, the hour will be established. That's what he said. Now you could make certain assumptions and say that boy is still young and is still walking around somewhere. He never got old. That's why it didn't happen. Or you could say, well, what he
Is there a
meant
belief in Islam of that there's some child?
I heard such explanations before, but it's not like a widespread fundamental belief. But people often try to explain that away by saying he was just referring to their own hour, but that doesn't really work. There's another thing where he says, I don't know, I cannot tell you when the hour will be, but within 100 years, none of the humans on the earth will be alive. He says something like that, which is in reference to the last hour, and found in those books, which seemingly says, I don't know when exactly, but within 100 years, it will end.
Yeah.
And he says many other things, like that Muslims will conquer Jerusalem and Constantinople, and then they will defeat the Romans, and then the Dajjal, the Islamic Antichrist, will appear, and then the end will come, and so on. The Romans are gone.
Yeah.
And so many more things. He says, one of my favorites is, he explains to one of his followers where the sun goes at night, and he says, it goes to its resting place till it under the throne of Allah and prostrates itself and asks for permission to rise again, and Allah gives it permission to rise. But one day Allah will not permit it to rise and will say, go back where you came from, and then the sun will travel to the other side and rise from the west, and that's when the day of judgment will come. I mean, there's just everything wrong with this.
Wow. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, so this is an interesting question. Maybe this can lead to our closing. Let's say you achieve your goal of helping Muslims exit Islam, especially the more extreme versions of Islam.
Every single Muslim.
Yes. Well, okay. Fair enough. I didn't know where you stood on that, but why? Where should they go? What should they become? Why not? My goal would be they should all become Christians.
Maybe they should.
So, like for me, I'm just thinking if people began to discover that Islam is not true, and they exit Islam and they all become atheists, secularists, who's to say that the consequence of that will not be just a different form of tyranny down the road? What is the best way of actually, Jordan Peterson talks a lot about the religious instinct there in the human psyche, and even if we were to rid the world of religion, something dogmatic would still take its place. This may be a bigger conversation, but for me, the safest place for ex-Muslims to land is a proper demonstration of the Christian faith, not medieval Catholicism version of the Christian, but the kind that Jesus invited people to practice, the truest expression of loving your neighbor.
Yeah.
So I know that's kind of a bomb to drop, but we've got to have something to advise these ex-Muslims to do.
Well, I actually kind of made a video about this in the past as a reaction. I guess I'm trying to remember what I said and what I listed, but it was kind of a video titled "If not Islam, then what?" Because people often come to me, even if they are Muslims or people of other beliefs, they come to me and ask, "So you say Islam is wrong? Then what else do you propose instead of Islam?" And I usually say nothing. I'm not here to give you anything to point you towards something better. I'm just saying that Islam is false and that Islam is bad for human flourishing and human development. It doesn't really follow that I have to therefore offer you an alternative which you are supposed to go to. I do my part in criticizing certain Islamic beliefs and pointing out why I criticize them. For example, Islam's treatment of women, of individual freedom, of other religious groups. I point out that these things are bad because they do not result in more well-being and peace and all that. On the contrary, they result in disabling humanity, causing suffering, which in return results in suffering toward Muslims themselves as well, and so on. So I guess I try to kind of give people an idea of why these things are bad and what they should not do even if they decide to leave Islam. And don't leave Islam and go out killing people. So what's the point of that? I mean, that's why we are against this religion, right? But what I say, if you so badly want me to say something to give you an alternative, is what I say to people. I'm not talking about you, but
Yeah.
is I think I said before, I choose to be a free thinker, to not stick to any label or box, I would say. But I found myself within I don't know, striving for universal well-being while exploring the idea of God and finding that I cannot believe in God. But you can be an atheist, you can be an agnostic, you can be a Christian if it makes you happy. You could be a Buddhist, which I find to be a very interesting way of living. You could become apathetic and just not care and live your life. It's also totally fine as long as you don't go around massacring people and oppressing others. But there are many ways of living your life, as long as you understand that that oppressing others and imposing your beliefs on others is not the way to go, because it will not result in happiness for you or for most people in the world. And that's
So, do you think Islam is bad enough to where leaving it for any alternative is a step in the right direction?
no. Yeah. Not sure if
I
I
mean,
can say.
obviously, there are worse. Nazism would not be a good alternative, but
Yeah, it wouldn't be. Yeah, I wouldn't say. I wouldn't say leave Islam and become a Nazi, or leave Islam and become, I don't know, you know, make human sacrifices and all that. Of course, there may be literally worse alternatives, but
yeah,
from the many options that you have, many of them are much better than Islam. It's
right.
it's not necessarily, it's not just the label Islam that is the bad thing. It's the things within Islam that are bad for you and bad for us, which is why you should leave it. And of course, it should be understood that the alternative to that is not adopting even worse beliefs and worse practices. Find something better.
Yeah. Well, I would invite them to come to Christ.
There you go.
So, and I would invite you as well. I'm sure you've had that in invitation many times.
Yeah.
My feeling on, I like where Jordan Peterson goes with the issue. I'm not sure if he's really a theist or not, but he at least sees the utility in the belief in a hierarchical structure, which theism is the ultimate hierarchical structure. And then Christianity would be the most benevolent presentation of that hierarchical structure. So, being that I'm not an anarchist, and I think a proper structure for reality where you can ground, you can properly ground what we observe in reality, laws of logic, laws of nature, laws of, all of the constants and quantities that we observe in the universe, grounding them into a ultimate reality or an ultimate source of truth, I think is philosophically proper. But also we were talking before the discussion about how do we justify morals. We obviously have a moral conviction that Islam is false. Mine would be more on an objective moral. I would assume yours would be on more of a subjective moral framework.
Yeah, I would just I say that morality is kind of non-cognitive. It is a human construct in order to function, in order to live in societies. I don't think anybody is obligated to follow a specific moral system. I don't think there's anything. I don't think I am, by nature guilty if I do things that may be considered unacceptable by most people in the world. Morality, to me, as I view it, is just something that humans over time invented in order to live better, in order to live in societies, and
Right.
and there's nothing wrong with that. If they want to pursue, well-being and peace in order to live better lives, nobody wants to live in fear and darkness. But here's the thing. I mean, I don't disagree entirely with the idea that religion is. That there is utility in religion. On the contrary, I agree with that. I don't consider myself an anti-theist. I don't hate religion. I don't think we should get rid of all religions actively. I think religion is an inevitable part and stage in human development. Religion came into existence necessarily because humans became more intelligent. As I view it, it is a sign of human intelligence. It is a means to establish proper societies, to share knowledge, to establish rules, and so on. And it is even useful in today's time to many people to lead a good life. But I would say that it's not necessary, and I would say it's also to a certain extent restrictive, which is why I just I don't think that it is that everybody needs it, but I understand the utility in it.
Yeah, and I agree that moral frameworks are invented, but I say that broadly, that, for example, I think the moral framework of Islam is an invented moral framework,
Yeah.
of Buddhism. I believe that the moral framework of Christianity originates with Christ, who is God in the flesh. So it's an eternal moral framework. And I think the existence of an eternal moral framework is something that can govern human affairs in a way that's going to give us the proper framework for not deviating from that which is ultimately good for mankind. And so that's what I'm coming at when I'm talking about, without something like that, it makes me very nervous because of how humans can so quickly create moral frameworks that are bad for society. I think that we're talking about necessary ultimate moral truths that are the case whether we like it or not. And thankfully, within the Christian moral framework, these truths proceed from a perfectly moral God who is love. And so if that's our guiding point, and Christians, if we approach the scriptures from that basic assumption, it's going to be our interpretive framework for passages that may be problematic. And so what I'm positing is that, what better framework can we think of than a morally perfect, completely loving God who sets forth that which is moral and immoral as a transcendent truth for humankind to anchor their moral frameworks into. Yeah, that's a bigger discussion, isn't it?
Yeah, here's the thing is, it's very uncomfortable for people. It was very uncomfortable for me to think of a world where there is no proper universal truth to moral values, that moral values are not, true, and that humans are basically free to establish whatever rules they want. They can come up with the worst things, the most horrible things, horrible for others or for themselves. It's a scary thing to think about, and it's very uncomfortable. Yes, which, however, does not mean that that is therefore, um, you know, factually wrong, or that it is, false, or whatever you want to
Right.
call it. That's just reality, in my opinion. That's just reality. That's just
The
how the
brute
world
fact.
is. Yeah, it's just, yeah, it's just, it is as it is. People want to survive, just like other animals want to survive, and they may come up with certain moral systems which might be a huge disadvantage to others or even to themselves without them knowing it. And here's the thing: others could argue that a Christian moral framework is harmful to humanity or harmful to their way of living, and so on, which does not necessarily mean that Christianity is therefore false. And again, the lack of prescribed morals within an atheistic or secular world does not necessarily mean that an atheistic or secular worldview is therefore false. It just means that facts are uncomfortable. They don't have to be comfortable, but we just have to work with that.
Yeah, yeah, it's not the primary argument for God that I take. I do think it has a philosophical appeal to it. If let's say you just kind of set Islam and Christianity aside and you say, let's just speak philosophically about the nature of morality and how one might be able to establish a morality that is objective. Well, it seems reasonable to say that a morality that would proceed from a morally perfect being who's all knowing, omnipotent, would qualify as an objective moral standard. Okay. Now we take that philosophical framework and is is that compatible with something like the Christian faith? Is that compatible with something like Islam? And that's a deeper discussion. On the Christian view,
Yeah.
we certainly everything rises and falls, no pun intended, on the resurrection. Because if Christ raised from the dead, it's God the Father's certification of Christ, and therefore the words of Christ are the objective moral standards for human conduct. So that would be the basic Christian approach, is that because Christ has risen from the dead, it's God's divine stamp of approval upon him. And so I think that that's a different discussion. Maybe we can come back and visit some of those things in a future interview. But I am concerned that if tomorrow every Muslim deconverted, that if they did not land in something like a God of love, it could be just as problematic a few hundred years from now as to whatever that group of human beings replaces their former Islam with as a system. And so that's a bigger discussion. But
in all honesty, I think if every Muslim left Islam today, they would find something, and they would be better off. We would all be better off without Islam.
You're probably right. I can't argue with that. Yeah. And then it'll be easier for me to share the Christian message with them.
See, there you go. Yeah.
And so it'll work for everybody.
We have a deal.
Man, it was great talking to you. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to having you back. And so, guys, make sure you like and share the video. Go over, and I'll put in a link in the description to AP's channel. Make sure you go follow him, and we'll see you guys in the very next episode. God bless.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.